So I would like to welcome, yay,
Hi, it
Adele.
worked.
So somebody who's not Adele, can you put in the chat window if you can hear Adele?
Hi, hello.
Can you hear her? I think they can. They are not. Yes, thank you. Thank you
Yay,
so much.
great.
Okay, wow, it worked on the first try. I don't know how this worked on the first try, but it's so. Adele, am I saying your name right? Adele and I have only communicated by email. So, am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah, you are. You are.
Awesome. So, Adele works for this fabulous company called HCMA Architecture and Design, which I got to spend some time on your website last
Oh,
night,
great.
this
Yeah.
morning, and it's so cool. If you have some spare time on your hand, I'd recommend it just for the inspiration. It's a very inspirational website. They are an architecture and design firm, and they are doing some really innovative things. And to give you an idea of just how innovative they are, Adele works for them with the job title of social impact researcher. That's amazing. An architecture and design firm that has that job title is very awesome.
Yeah, it is. We have our own little team of researchers. We have another social impact like coordinator and researcher, and we've got environmental research team, as well as engagement specialists too. So it's a pretty cool interdisciplinary group.
Right.
Yeah.
It is awesome. I'm actually going to try and stop sharing my screen so that, yeah, good. We can see both of us. Fabulous. I should put that up so you have. Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Adele sent me some great questions by email, and I thought, when I was doing these once a month, you folks all looking at me talk for 30 minutes or so isn't too bad. But if I'm going to do these once a week, you're probably going to get really super sick of just looking at my face. So why don't we get some of these people? Also, because your questions, Adele, were more kind of more conceptual than just simply how to calculate something. So I thought it might be good to have a conversation. Do you want to read your questions? Okay.
Oh, yeah, I can give them a little bit of context too,
Okay, great.
maybe as well.
Fabulous.
So yeah, and just background of myself. I haven't studied like evaluation before, but I'm very intrigued by equitable evaluation discourse that's happening. So I've been to a few of these, and I'm learning a lot. And architects have the architectural field and design field has a lot to learn from you folk. So my first question is, if you have any advice for setting project targets in relation to equitable evaluation. So I'm specifically thinking about an architectural project. It's a community center, but we can make it more broad if that's easier. And a bit of context is that it's common practice in architecture to have environmental impact targets set about like greenhouse gas emission reduction or energy efficiency. However, when it comes to the social dimension of things, it's kind of new uncharted territory, but we want to be able to set targets that are related to reducing barriers and enhancing inclusivity for everyone and things like that. And so I'm curious if there's advice you can give in relation to that. And like a sub question for that would be, can you set qualitative targets, or is that for a client team, it's kind of harder to digest that usually because they always see quantitative type targets. Should we involve community in setting targets if it's going to be equitable, because to really understand the needs and the nuance? Yeah, that's my first question.
Yeah, great. So these are fantastic questions, and there's of course many answers, but a couple of short ones right off the top is that it's always extremely helpful if you can get input from as many different types of stakeholders as possible, because absolutely, like, how you define success is incredibly important to how much you can embed equity in a project. So for example, if a project decides to define success as our company will make as much money as possible, I mean, that's a legitimate goal, and it'll have very specific equity impacts. Whereas if the company's goal is something that is, even in relation to, I mean, that one's a little bit obvious, like too on the nose. But for example, I was once working in a project where they decided that the goal was that they wanted to do some women's empowerment, and they wanted to have more women making their own decisions about how to spend their own money. So they started counting, like at the beginning of the project, how many women felt like they could make their own decisions around their money. And at the end of the project, how many women could make their own decisions. But then when we went into the field and really listened to the women who we were, like, quote unquote, attempting to empower, which is a whole other conversation, we found out that they themselves did not consider making their own decisions around their money their goal. They wanted to make decisions in collaboration with their partner, and that's what they wanted more than anything. And so because we hadn't talked to them, our definition of success, although we were trying to be very empowering, was not equitable, because it was an external definition of success. That's a more nuanced example. And so absolutely, including as many different voices in defining success and defining what to measure is always really, really helpful. And then the second thing, in terms of how can you make sort of outcomes or dependent variables or goals or KPIs, depending on what sector you're in, you call them all different things, equitable? And the answer is definitely yes. And interestingly, I hadn't really thought about this till right now, but the way you do that is kind of what we were talking about at the beginning of data amnesty, is that you do that by making dependent variables or outcomes relative rather than absolute. So one example that I have used in the past is if you're going in to try and you're going into a community, say my community here in Toronto, and you're going to set up some food supports, and you're going to try and increase everyone's access to nutrition. You're going to try to increase the number of fruits and vegetables that everybody eats. If you just measure how many fruits and vegetables everybody eats, or even the change in how many fruits and vegetables everybody eats, you're not actually accounting for equity in that. Because right now in Toronto, of course, there's a certain group of people, say we'll just call them group 1, that already eats a lot more fruits and vegetables, and group 2 eats a lot less fruits and vegetables. And if they both go up by like 20%, there's still a gap. We still have an equity gap. So if instead of just measuring the absolute change, like how much more fruits and vegetables does everybody in Toronto eat, instead make the KPI the gap. So instead of making the KPI everybody eats 20% more, you can make the dependent variable or the target that the gap between the people that eat the most fruits and vegetables and the people that eat the least fruits and vegetables comes down by 25%. It is possible to do both of those things. You don't have to choose, you can do both. One of the complaints that you might get from that is that it might slow progress. Because if you actually make that equitable outcome variable, so maybe lowering the gap, the nutrition gap, rather than making everybody go up and maintaining the gap, but reducing the gap, that might be more challenging, because you have to affect a lot of change at the bottom of that ladder to get the gap to close. Like you don't want to get the gap to close by having group one eat less fruits and vegetables, right? You want them to eat the same or more.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so you actually have to really be successful at lifting the people that eat the less fruits and vegetables a lot in order to close the gap. And so frankly, that's one reason that people don't like to use equity-based outcome variables, because it makes your project harder.
That's really interesting though, because in like universal design principles, this is about designing for the folk who face the most barriers.
Right.
So it's really an equitable approach, and like for us, at least at our firm, that is what we strive to do.
Yes.
Always. So it's, at least for us, it's embedded in our aspirations from the get-go. But that I hadn't thought about that as a way to also like have language and structure what a goal or a target could be. And I'm wondering now if how to measure things like that. And again, like bringing in the qualitative question, like, could you have a target that speaks to that reduction of gap, but maybe recognizes that someone who's seeking to analyze that in a quantitative way, like that might not be feasible, but it's still something that can be qualified.
Yeah, so absolutely. The third question is, can you have qualitative targets? Yes, you can have qualitative targets. And how you think about qualitative data or analyze qualitative data is just by its very nature extremely unique. So how you're measuring change qualitatively would be specific to your project, your comfort zones. But the thing to do to make sure that you embed equity in the qualitative approach is pretty much exactly what we've talked about. One, make sure that you get qualitative feedback from people that are basically, one way to tell is if it's incredibly hard work on your part. Because the people who are most at risk are the people that are hardest to get qualitative data from in 8 out of 10 situations. That's not in every situation, but because it's very time consuming and it involves trust and it involves transparency. And so work on that. And then whatever method you do use to analyze your qualitative data, whether it's theming or whether it's, sort of semi-structured analysis, ethnography, there's so many different ways, but just make sure that you, again, are looking to see if the rate of change or the type of change that you're seeing in each group is about equivalent, or are you actually able to produce greater qualitative change in the group that's producing the most vulnerability, that is the most limited in its access to whatever resource you're trying to provide, has the most barriers.
Okay.
I think we'll have to have a quantitative expert on. I do quantitative work, but I'm not a quantitative expert. So send me your quantitative expert suggestions, because I think we'll get one on for one of these Wednesdays.
Qualitative or quantitative?
Qualitative.
Okay. Yeah. That was really helpful. Shall I ask my second question?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the next one was, for an evaluation to be equitable, do you have to ask demographic questions? And the context for this is a survey that we'll be sending to students and teachers at a school that we've designed. And there has been hesitation to put in demographic questions just because the school board has an ethics review process, and because of fears of privacy, there might be hesitation to ask questions about a bit like different ability levels and how someone identifies themselves in various ways. Yeah.
So that's a very important question. Thank you so much for asking it. And there's not a really simple answer. So the first thing I should say is that there's, especially in kind of the super quantitative machine learning kind of field, there's a section of that field that really thinks that as long as you don't include any demographics in your model won't be biased. That is a good attempt. It is completely wrong. They're called blind models, or sometimes, usually called blind models, and that does not work. But it's a very good effort. A for effort, unfortunately, bad reality. So if you do have access to demographic variables, it is very important to use them in an equity-based analysis. So, but that's not quite the question you're asking. I think the question you're asking is one that people face a lot. I face it a lot, which is if you're designing a project and you are very hesitant to include demographic variables, what do you do? So there's a couple of options, and I have faced this for a couple of reasons. One, a similar reason to yourself, when you're working with certain populations, you're simply not allowed to ask demographic questions. Also, in a lot of places, certain countries, collecting demographic variables of a sensitive nature can put the respondents at extreme risk, both social risk and legal risk. And unless you have very, very good data encryption, you just can't collect data because you're genuinely putting the person at risk. So we've done a couple of different things. None of them are perfect, but essentially the first step is to maybe sit down and figure out what kind of why you want the demographics specifically. So we know you want them to be equitable, but how do you think that it's likely that a person's demographics or socioeconomics are changing the equity of the situation you're in? So for the nutrition example that I was using in Toronto, we would want the demographics because we think probably your socioeconomic status is affecting your level of access to food, and also maybe where you live, and also maybe the color of your skin in Toronto is. So we would want those things because those three we think are probably affecting people's ability to access nutrition or access food. So if we're not allowed to ask those or don't want to ask those for a variety of reasons, there's a couple of options. One is you can ask proxy variables. Now, this is kind of the opposite because, of course, proxy variables are hugely problematic for equity. However, hardly anything is inherently good or inherently bad. So just like proxy variables are used for bad and evil a lot, you can also use proxy variables for good. So it is possible to very carefully use a variable that isn't a sociodemographic variable to measure something very close to the sociodemographics. So it would be possible if geography is going to be an issue, you can use their address or a part of their address. Sometimes if there might be another variable that you could collect that would be very, very closely related to the demographic that you want but can't collect. And this sometimes takes some very creative thinking. So if you can't ask about income, you can ask sometimes something about, and this varies a lot from place to place, but in some places, which type of phone they use is very, very closely connected to their income. So basically you have to think of stereotypes. You have to figure out what is very closely related to the demographic variable that you need and how you could get it in another way by measuring something that's strongly related to that variable. So there's pros and cons to that, but it's certainly an option, and how ethical it is really depends on the situation. Secondly, you can ask people to just self-rate. So you can't, and obviously in many ways we can't say, what's your sexual orientation in many, many countries. We simply cannot ask that question. But you can say something like, if you have, in terms of income, when we can't ask income because people won't answer it, we can ask, how wealthy do you feel compared to your community? 5 being very wealthy, 1 being not wealthy. We can ask, do you feel that you have ever been discriminated against because of your social identity?
Right.
We can ask, do you feel privileged by your social identity? Like, it's hard to get that in just one question, but if you can ask 2 or 3 questions about like how they feel in relation to their community, because that honestly is really important. Like, in some ways, how they feel is more important than the other boxes that they're going to check in terms of their barriers, because you can't measure every single sociodemographic. I mean, there might be, a person who would check certain demographic boxes that would make them look very privileged, but then they have, like, maybe you're not collecting disability data, or maybe you're not collecting trauma data. Hardly anybody collects trauma data, right? And if you're in a sociodemographic group that's normally privileged, but you've experienced a lot of very, very severe trauma in your life, you are probably not experiencing that same world of privilege. So there's a lot to be said for simply asking people not to identify, what sexual orientation they are, what race they are, what color their skin is, all those things. But simply asking, like, do you feel privileged? Do you feel discriminated against? Have you been bullied? Have you been not given access to food? Do you have trouble affording food? Things like that, that actually directly kind of get at the problem.
And then if you ask questions like that, self-rating questions about experiences of discrimination or privilege, would you follow that up? I'm thinking now how you link that feeling to, if you're trying to understand what system, like what identity, social identities that they have or that they express might be leading to discrimination within their community, how to link that self-rating question to those identity markers without just making assumptions, whether that would be by also having the proxy questions or by having open-ended options where people can articulate that if they want to, like why they self-rate that way.
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of open-ended questions, I didn't mention that because it depends on your situation, but asking open-ended demographic questions is fantastic. Like, we've done that in many high schools where you're not actually, where they don't mind you asking their gender, but they don't want you to put in options other than male or female, or they can't come to a consensus about what options they want. So we just put, what is your gender, and make it a blank. So there are no options, and they write in. And I've had pretty good, I mean, obviously there's some people that write in like octopus and things like that, which in this case was not a identity, it was just somebody screwing with the survey. But that works really well. And if I was going to do not the proxies, but the second thing where I simply ask them to self-identify, I would not try and link those to any specific sociodemographics. I would just use those instead of demographics. So in your analysis where you would have had demographics, just have the answers to those questions. Yeah, no, I think it would be way too hard and very problematic to try and link those to specifics. Yeah, great question. I'm glad you asked it. This is why I was so hoping that you would come on. So we only have about 1 more minute, but do you have any more questions, or does anybody attending want to write any questions into the chat? And while we wait,
that was really helpful.
Excuse me?
That was really helpful. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's helpful to so many people. We get a lot of people writing in how many people are just don't want to ask questions because, you know, they feel silly or stupid. And it's, of course, it's not silly or stupid at all. It's incredibly important. And as you can see, I don't know the answer to tons of the questions on the spot, and I just will get back to you. So I really, really appreciated, Adele, that you came on.